Okay, well, it's story time again here. It's not trans story time, though. I'm not going to wear a dress or anything, but it is story time. It's been kind of a mixed bag weather-wise today. It's been sunny and warm and cold and breezy, and it's rained heavily, and it's done a little bit of everything except it hasn't snowed or hailed or anything. So it's been an interesting day weather-wise. Rocky's inside the camper sleeping on my bed. I just remade my bed. I managed to rearrange the cushions underneath there in such a way that I was able to partially eliminate Sleepy Hollow. So I'm hoping I'll have a better sleep tonight and I won't have that sinking feeling throughout the night, where I'm partially sunk down into a crevice there or whatever in the bed, or a canyon or whatever. Anyway, this is a story I'm going to tell about when I was a young guy back in the 1980s, because I'm old, so I was a young man back in the 1980s. And a little bit about work and something I did for work. Now, you got to bear in mind that the 1980s was a different time. The world was different in the 1980s. In many ways, it was better, and in many ways, it wasn't so good. And one thing that used to happen in the 1980s is if you had a job, you would sometimes be exploited. And sometimes you had to accept being exploited in order to maintain your employment. That meant that sometimes you had to put in a lot of hours that weren't paid hours in order to continue to be paid for the other hours that you worked, to keep your job. And that basically happened to me. I had two jobs at the time. I worked from 4 to midnight in a wire factory, and I was in school during the day. I was in high school. This is going back to 1985, 1986, so I was 17, 18 years old, so I was finishing up high school. And I had that job because I was on my own, and I was from 15 on, I was on my own. And I had that job, and the other job I had is I worked part-time at our local museum, which was called the Matheson House. Or the Perth Museum, because it was in the town of Perth, Ontario, Canada. Anyway, I had these two jobs. I started the job at Central Wire Industries in 1983, and I started the job at the Perth Museum around 84, 85, somewhere in there. Anyway, our curator got the idea. There was a lady, an elderly woman who lived not too far away from the museum, just around the corner basically from it. And she was quite a wealthy lady, and her name was Mrs. Beeman. And she had been Dr. Beeman's wife. She was Dr. Beeman's widow. Dr. Beeman had passed away some years before that. And she was an elderly woman, Mrs. Beeman was. Really nice lady, wonderful lady. I can't say a word against the woman. Very nice woman. Anyway, she had a lot of antiques. I mean a lot. Her whole house, it was actually quite beautiful. All the antique furniture and antique stuff. And one of the things that she had that was really quite amazing, and I'll tell you, when you live back then, you learn to respect the previous generations, because we saw firsthand what those people could do and what they had done. And that's kind of lost now, Technology has kind of taken that away in some respects. But then here I am using technology to keep it alive in a way, so there is that. But anyway, she had a huge collection of beautiful brass ornaments and brass replicas and things that were all made from shell casings, from brass shell casings during World War I. And it was some relation of hers that had been in World War I, and this guy had been picking up the brass shell casings off the battlefield, and in the off time, when they weren't trying to avoid getting killed, because in the war, basically, it was like this. You either had a lot of activity and a lot of trauma, and you were really fighting for your life, and, your friends were getting killed around you, getting blown up and everything else, or you were bored out of your skull. And a lot of the men did different crafts in order to keep themselves occupied during the off time when they weren't, busy just trying not to be killed. And so, and these guys, it's amazing the stuff these guys did. It really is. Like, you'd have to see it to believe it. I have no pictures of this stuff. I wish I did, but I don't. In those days, photography was expensive. Plus, if I was going into a person's house, that's their private space and their property. I wasn't going to go in there and take pictures, bring a camera in and take pictures of their stuff, in their house. That just wouldn't be right. But I was told that I had to go and polish all this brass for Mrs. Beeman, and I had to keep it all up and keep it polished, because our curator was hoping that by sending me over there to do that on my own time, that when she passed on, that she would leave all that stuff to the museum, you see. As an employee, he's going to send an employee over to do this. Anyway, it used to take 6 hours. From when I'd arrive to when I'd leave, it'd be about 6 hours to polish all this stuff up. And it also included all the brass poles on her beautiful old furniture that she had and stuff, the drawer poles and stuff like that. Had to take the poles right off the furniture so as not to get the polish on the wood, around the poles and all that. Had to polish all the brass on her front door. She had a brass door knocker, and of course a brass plate, a kick plate on the bottom of the door, and brass knob and brass key thing, and all that, a brass letterbox, all that had to be polished too outside. And plus all these ornaments. And it was beautiful though. The stuff she had it was amazing, the detail and the ornateness of it. She had this one thing there I can remember, and it would be about the size of the palm of my hand. Like, I could put it in the palm of my hand. And what it was is it was an officer's hat. A hat that a Canadian Army officer would have worn during World War I. And it was all made out of brass. It was made out of a brass shell casing. So it was all cut out and pounded out and everything. And it was amazing, the detail of that thing. And they even used different colors of brass. So like the band on the hat was a darker brass than the rest of the hat and stuff. It was really well done. It even had a look to it because it wasn't smooth on the top. It actually beat it a little bit. So it had that kind of rumpled look like it would have, and stuff. So it wasn't completely smooth on the top, but it had little dimples and dents in it and stuff, and it was all uneven. So it really did look like a real hat. Everything was like that. Every little detail had been thought of by whoever made this stuff, by this relation of hers. And I can't remember now if it was her father or her uncle, or if it might have been a relation of her husband's too. It might have been a relation through marriage. I really don't know. Anyway, she was a wonderful old lady, and I didn't mind to do the work for her, and I came to really like her. But, of course, it was too much for me because I had 2 jobs and I was in school, and it was just too much for me. And I eventually had to sit her down and say, look, my curator at the museum over there is making me do this, and I like you, and I don't begrudge it to you, but the problem is it's just too much for me. And I remember she used to pay me at the end of the night. When I'd come over to do it, she'd pay me, but usually it'd be maybe $5 or something, which even in the 1980s wasn't very much money for 6 hours work. But she was one of these people who was very much living in the past, and of course in her day $5 was a lot of money. I think she still had the idea that things were like they were back in the 40s and 50s, and $5 was a good pay for 6 hours work. Anyway, I used to just thank her and take the money, and I understood that she didn't realize how little money that actually was. I mean, I was making $5 an hour at the wire factory, and I was making $3.15 an hour at the museum. But I'd work there for 6 hours and I'd get $5. But that wasn't why I stopped doing it, though, because I got that I did like the lady, and I didn't mind doing those things for her. helping her to keep her stuff nice and so on. And I could see how much pride she took in that stuff. And like that, so I didn't mind to do it, but it was just that it was too much for me, so I had to stop. But anyway, that's just a story I remember from my past. She's long gone now. She passed away many years ago. One thing that was kind of funny, our doctor in Perth, one of our doctors was a fellow by the name of Dr. Tweedy. Dr. Tweedy actually nearly killed me in the early 1990s, and Dr. Tweedy, I can't say very much good about Dr. Tweedy, really. I really can't, so I'll try not to say very much. But what I will tell you is that all the old ladies in town loved Dr. Tweedy, or at least a lot of them did, including one of my great aunts. And the reason was he used to keep them doped right up to the eyeballs, and he'd tell them to drink a bottle of house wine every day, on top of taking all these other drugs that he had them on. Just keep them right out of it, and they thought that was great. They could be drunk and high under doctor's orders. And anyway, Mrs. Beeman, I remember usually what would happen is, after I had been there for an hour or two, she'd go upstairs and sleep. And I'd just finish my work, and I'd leave. I'd lock her door behind me when I went out. Sometimes she'd leave my $5 bill on the table for me, or sometimes she'd wake up and come down and pay me before I left, or sometimes I get my money the next time I came. When I arrived, she'd have $5 for me from my previous work, and stuff. Anyway, but yeah, I remember that. Anyway, she used to have a lot of pills there, and she used to have her bottle of wine, house wine, and that was doctor's orders. Dr. Tweedy had said, this is what you do. Anyway, another kind of interesting story that I found out, one of my aunts told me this story when I was doing that work, is my dad in the early 50s had a bit of a love affair with Mrs. Beeman's daughter. They were about the same age, and they were both in their early teens. And apparently my dad would write love letters to Mrs. Beeman's daughter, and Mrs. Beeman's daughter